My name is Isabella Hart, and I am 28 years old. 2 weeks ago, I stood in a holding room at Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, detained by European Border Control. I had no passport, no phone, and no credit cards. My parents and my older sister had just walked through the terminal doors and boarded a connecting flight, leaving me stranded in a foreign country. They thought stranding me without an identity would force me to stay quiet about what my sister was smuggling into the port of Tacoma. I sat under the harsh fluorescent lights, waiting for the Dutch police to decide my fate. Then the heavy metal door opened. A man in a tailored suit, a multimillionaire shipping magnate I had never met, walked into the holding area. He did not look at the guards. He leaned down next to my chair and whispered, "Pretend you are with my team. My jet is waiting, but more importantly, my attorney is already here. Your family is going to regret making this sloppy." Before I tell you exactly how we dismantled my sister's fraudulent business and stripped my parents of their control, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Front Porch Revenge. Drop your age and where you are listening from in the comments. Now let me take you back 3 hours to the passport control line where the illusion of my family finally shattered. We had just stepped off a 9-hour red-eye flight from Seattle. My legs ached and my eyes burned from the dry recycled cabin air. Washington State was thousands of miles away, leaving behind the gray skies of Puget Sound for the sprawling transit hubs of Europe. My mother Carol had pitched this trip as a healing vacation. It was supposed to be a chance to reset the family dynamics after months of tense dinners and strained phone calls back home. I work as an international trade compliance specialist. I manage global supply chains and customs regulations for a major logistics firm. My older sister Mallory is a social media influencer launching a luxury imported goods boutique. Our worlds collided when I noticed glaring legal discrepancies in her initial import paperwork. I brought it up privately, attempting to save her from federal fines. My parents treated my concern as a petty, jealous attack against the golden child. This trip was supposed to smooth over those rough edges. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe my family just wanted to spend time with me. That deep-seated desire to belong made me careless. I travel for a living. I know the cardinal rule of international transit is to never let your documents out of your sight. But standing near the duty-free shops in Schiphol, I let my guard down. My father Dennis held out his hand for my navy blue passport wallet, offering to keep all our documents together to speed up the family check-in process. My mother offered to plug my phone into the portable battery bank resting deep inside her heavy leather tote bag. I handed over my lifeline and my legal identity simply because I wanted to feel like a daughter being taken care of instead of a compliance auditor constantly on duty. We approached the European Union border control checkpoint. The line was long, weaving through the sterile white terminal. Mallory returned from the duty-free cosmetics counter holding a small shopping bag. She caught my eye and offered a tight, smug smile that I recognized instantly. It was the look she wore when our parents funded her lifestyle while I paid my own way through college. It was the look of a sister who knew she had already won a game I did not even know we were playing. Dennis stepped up to the glass booth, handing a stack of Navy booklets to the Dutch border officer. Carol and Mallory slipped through the turnstile right behind him, moving with an urgent practice speed. I stepped forward, waiting for my father to hand the officer my booklet. He did not. Dennis shoved the remaining passports into his jacket pocket and kept walking. I froze. I assumed it was a simple mistake. I called out to him over the ambient noise of the crowd. "Dad, you forgot to hand him mine." My father did not turn around. He did not pause his stride. Carol walked stiffly beside him, looking straight ahead, refusing to make eye contact with me. Mallory glanced back over her shoulder. She raised her hand, giving me a tiny, mocking wave through the thick security glass. Then they turned the corner, heading toward the departure gates for their onward flight. The border officer, a tall man with a stern, weathered face, looked at me. "Madam," he said, his accented English cutting through the terminal noise, "I need your travel documents." I pointed toward the corner my family had just turned. "My father has my passport," I said, my voice tightening with a sudden spiking panic. "He has my wallet. My mother has my phone." The officer frowned. He picked up his radio, speaking a few rapid sentences in Dutch. Another officer standing near the exit corridor stepped forward and looked down the hall where my family had vanished. He walked back to the booth and spoke quietly to his colleague. The man in the booth looked at me with a mixture of professional suspicion and quiet pity. "The man you pointed to stopped walking for a moment," the officer explained, setting his radio down. He looked back at the checkpoint and mouthed a message. "He said to tell you that you should have stayed out of your sister's business." The words hit me with the blunt force of a physical strike. You should have stayed out of your sister's business. This was not a mistake. This was not travel fatigue or a simple oversight. They had planned this. They had invited me on a transatlantic flight, secured my documents, and intentionally abandoned me at a federal checkpoint thousands of miles from Seattle. They stripped me of my mobility, my money, and my communication, intending to trap me in an administrative nightmare while Mallory executed whatever illicit trade maneuver she had scheduled back at the port of Tacoma. For 10 agonizing seconds, I stood there, the humiliation burning my cheeks. Travelers behind me grumbled, pushing their luggage carts forward. I felt the familiar urge to shrink, to beg for a phone to cry, and plead for someone to catch my parents before they boarded their plane. But the panic did not take root. As the border guards moved closer, preparing to detain an undocumented traveler, the scared daughter vanished. The International Trade Compliance Specialist took over. I deal with border protection agencies, cargo holds, and federal regulations every single day. I know exactly how government systems operate. You do not survive customs delays with emotion. You survive with concrete paper trails. I squared my shoulders and looked directly at the primary officer. "My name is Isabella Hart," I stated, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any hysteria. "I am a citizen of the United States of America. My passport number is 042791188. My family members Dennis and Carol Hart intentionally removed my federal travel documents and my personal communication devices from my possession. I need you to formally log that I am reporting a theft committed by the passengers who just cleared your checkpoint." The officer raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised by the sudden shift in my demeanor. I did not sound like a frantic, abandoned tourist. I sounded like an auditor establishing a timeline. "I cannot let you pass." "Madam," the officer said, his tone shifting to standard rigid protocol. "You have no proof of identity." "I understand," I replied calmly, holding my ground. "I am requesting a transfer to your secondary inspection holding area, and I am requesting immediate contact with the United States Consulate in Amsterdam." 2 armed airport police officers stepped forward, flanking me. They did not place me in handcuffs, but their presence was a firm, undeniable reality. I had no money. I had no phone. I was separated from the world by a pane of security glass and the cold calculation of my own parents. They escorted me away from the bright terminal and down a long gray corridor leading deep into the administrative bowels of Schiphol Airport. My family thought they had silenced me by locking me in a European holding room. They forgot that I make my living unlocking borders. The secondary inspection room at Schiphol Airport stripped away any remaining illusion of a family vacation. The walls were painted a stark, institutional gray, offering nothing to distract from the reality of detention. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, relentless frequency, making my red-eye fatigue feel like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. I sat on a hard metal chair, clutching the handle of my small carry-on bag. It was the only possession I had left. No phone to call my office, no credit card to book a return flight, no passport to prove I had a right to exist on this side of the ocean. I watched the second hand on the wall clock tick forward, knowing every minute that passed put my parents and my sister closer to their connecting gate. The heavy door opened, and a Dutch border officer walked in carrying a plain manila folder. Her name badge read, Marieke Vos. She did not look imposing or angry. She looked tired and cautious. She took a seat across the metal table, folding her hands neatly over the file. I prepared to deliver my statement again, to explain the theft and demand to speak with a consular official. But Marieke spoke first, and her words dismantled my entire strategy. She told me they had already received a report regarding my situation. My chest tightened. I asked who filed the report, hoping airport security had stopped my father before he could board. Marieke looked at me with a steady, clinical gaze. She explained that a woman claiming to be my mother had stopped at a transit assistance desk near the departure lounge. Carol had voluntarily approached the authorities before boarding her flight. She told them I was experiencing a severe psychological episode. According to my mother, I was upset, confused, and outright refusing to travel with the family. The breath caught in my throat. My mother had not just abandoned me. She had actively poisoned the well, laying down a cover story to ensure the border police viewed me as a liability rather than a victim. I reacted exactly the way my family knew I would. I panicked. I leaned across the metal table and started talking too fast. I tried to explain the convoluted history of our family dynamics in a single breath. I told the officer about my sister Mallory and her luxury goods boutique. I babbled about how I had criticized her import filings a few weeks ago because they lacked the proper compliance codes and how it caused a terrible fight. I explained that my mother had organized this entire European vacation as a so-called family healing trip to smooth things over. I was desperately throwing puzzle pieces onto the table, hoping this stranger would put them together and see the trap I had walked into. Marieke held up a hand, stopping my frantic rush of words. Her expression shifted from cautious to sympathetic, which was far more terrifying. She looked at me the way a medical professional looks at someone who is deeply unwell. She opened the manila folder and read from a printed incident log. She said my mother was very apologetic about leaving me behind. Carol had told the transit desk that her daughters argued over business and that I could not separate my career from my family. Marieke looked up from the paper and recited my mother's exact quote. She said, "Your mother told us you have always made professional things personal." Hearing my mother weaponize my career against me felt like a bucket of ice water poured over my head. I realized in that instant what I looked like to this officer. I was a disheveled traveler with no documents rambling about sibling rivalries and import filings to federal police. I sounded exactly like the hysterical, unstable daughter Carol had described. My desperate need to prove my innocence was giving them every reason to keep me detained. I was feeding the very narrative my family had designed to trap me. I closed my eyes, taking one long, measured breath. I forced the panicked daughter back into the shadows and let the compliance auditor take the wheel. I open containers of mislabeled freight for a living. I resolve federal holds and navigate institutional bureaucracy. You do not win an argument with customs by explaining your feelings. You win by establishing a paper trail. I opened my eyes and looked at Marieke. I stopped trying to explain why my family left me and focused entirely on how they left me. "Officer Voss," I said, my voice dropping into a flat professional register. "I understand what my mother reported, but I need you to document a factual timeline. I am not refusing to travel. I am unable to travel because I have been stripped of my property. I ask that you log 3 specific facts into your official record right now." Marieke blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in my demeanor. The frantic rambling was gone, replaced by cold dictation. First, I stated, keeping my eyes locked on hers, my father, Dennis Hart, took physical possession of my passport wallet at 6:15 this morning near the duty-free concourse. Second, my mother, Carol Hart, placed my cellular phone into her leather tote bag under the guise of charging the battery. Third, my sister, Mallory Hart, borrowed my corporate credit card just before we approached the checkpoint. They did not leave me behind during a mental health crisis. They systematically removed my ability to function and then boarded an international flight. Marieke stopped looking at me with pity. The crisp delivery of dates, times, and specific actions triggered her own procedural instincts. The vague story of a hysterical daughter was suddenly overshadowed by a very precise allegation of theft. She picked up her pen and began writing down my statement exactly as I requested. I kept talking, reinforcing my credibility to distance myself from the smear my mother had planted. I told her I worked as an international trade compliance specialist, managing global supply chains. I explained that I needed to contact the United States consulate immediately because my professional identity was vulnerable. I told her I could not sit in a holding room because I was currently listed as an importer of record on active federal accounts that required my direct supervision. I did not realize my voice had carried across the quiet room. I was entirely focused on the Dutch officer taking my statement. But at a holding desk 20 feet away, an older man wearing a tailored wool suit lowered the newspaper he had been reading. He had been sitting there quietly waiting for an administrative delay regarding his own travel documents to be resolved. He heard the phrase "importer of record" cut through the sterile silence of the inspection room. He folded his paper, set it on the metal table, and looked directly at me. The secondary inspection room at Schiphol Airport stripped away any remaining illusion of a family vacation. The walls were painted a stark, institutional gray, offering nothing to distract from the reality of detention. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, relentless frequency, making my red-eye fatigue feel like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. I sat on a hard metal chair clutching the handle of my small carry-on bag. It was the only possession I had left. No phone to call my office. No credit card to book a return flight. No passport to prove I had a right to exist on this side of the ocean. I watched the second hand on the wall clock tick forward, knowing every minute that passed put my parents and my sister closer to their connecting gate. The heavy door opened, and a Dutch border officer walked in carrying a plain manila folder. Her name badge read Marieke Vos. She did not look imposing or angry. She looked tired and cautious. She took a seat across the metal table, folding her hands neatly over the file. I prepared to deliver my statement again to explain the theft and demand to speak with a consular official. But Marieke spoke first, and her words dismantled my entire strategy. She told me they had already received a report regarding my situation. My chest tightened. I asked who filed the report, hoping airport security had stopped my father before he could board. Marieke looked at me with a steady clinical gaze. She explained that a woman claiming to be my mother had stopped at a transit assistance desk near the departure lounge. Carol had voluntarily approached the authorities before boarding her flight. She told them I was experiencing a severe psychological episode. According to my mother, I was upset, confused, and outright refusing to travel with the family. The breath caught in my throat. My mother had not just abandoned me. She had actively poisoned the well, laying down a cover story to ensure the border police viewed me as a liability rather than a victim. I reacted exactly the way my family knew I would. I panicked. I leaned across the metal table and started talking too fast. I tried to explain the convoluted history of our family dynamics in a single breath. I told the officer about my sister Mallory and her luxury goods boutique. I babbled about how I had criticized her import filings a few weeks ago because they lacked the proper compliance codes and how it caused a terrible fight. I explained that my mother had organized this entire European vacation as a so-called family healing trip to smooth things over. I was desperately throwing puzzle pieces onto the table, hoping this stranger would put them together and see the trap I had walked into. Marieke held up a hand, stopping my frantic rush of words. Her expression shifted from cautious to sympathetic, which was far more terrifying. She looked at me the way a medical professional looks at someone who is deeply unwell. She opened the manila folder and read from a printed incident log. She said my mother was very apologetic about leaving me behind. Carol had told the transit desk that her daughters argued over business and that I could not separate my career from my family. Marieke looked up from the paper and recited my mother's exact quote. She said, "Your mother told us you have always made professional things personal. Hearing my mother weaponize my career against me felt like a bucket of ice water poured over my head. I realized in that instant what I looked like to this officer. I was a disheveled traveler with no documents rambling about sibling rivalries and import filings to federal police. I sounded exactly like the hysterical, unstable daughter Carol had described. My desperate need to prove my innocence was giving them every reason to keep me detained. I was feeding the very narrative my family had designed to trap me. I closed my eyes, taking one long, measured breath. I forced the panicked daughter back into the shadows and let the compliance auditor take the wheel. I open containers of mislabeled freight for a living. I resolve federal holds and navigate institutional bureaucracy. You do not win an argument with customs by explaining your feelings. You win by establishing a paper trail. I opened my eyes and looked at Marieke. I stopped trying to explain why my family left me and focused entirely on how they left me. Officer Voss, I said, my voice dropping into a flat professional register. I understand what my mother reported, but I need you to document a factual timeline. I am not refusing to travel. I am unable to travel because I have been stripped of my property. I ask that you log 3 specific facts into your official record right now. Mariki blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in my demeanor. The frantic rambling was gone, replaced by cold dictation. First I stated, keeping my eyes locked on hers. My father, Dennis Hart, took physical possession of my passport wallet at 6:15 this morning near the duty-free concourse. Second, my mother, Carol Hart, placed my cellular phone into her leather tote bag under the guise of charging the battery. Third, my sister, Mallory Hart, borrowed my corporate credit card just before we approached the checkpoint. They did not leave me behind during a mental health crisis. They systematically removed my ability to function and then boarded an international flight. Mariki stopped looking at me with pity. The crisp delivery of dates, times, and specific actions triggered her own procedural instincts. The vague story of a hysterical daughter was suddenly overshadowed by a very precise allegation of theft. She picked up her pen and began writing down my statement exactly as I requested. I kept talking, reinforcing my credibility to distance myself from the smear my mother had planted. I told her I worked as an international trade compliance specialist managing global supply chains. I explained that I needed to contact the United States consulate immediately because my professional identity was vulnerable. I told her I could not sit in a holding room because I was currently listed as an importer of record on active federal accounts that required my direct supervision. I did not realize my voice had carried across the quiet room. I was entirely focused on the Dutch officer taking my statement. But at a holding desk, 20 feet away, an older man wearing a tailored wool suit lowered the newspaper he had been reading. He had been sitting there quietly waiting for an administrative delay regarding his own corporate aircraft paperwork to be resolved. He heard the phrase "importer of record" cut through the sterile silence of the inspection room. He folded his paper, set it on the metal table, and looked directly at me. The man across the room folded his newspaper with deliberate precision. He was in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind of quiet, understated clothing that signals generational wealth. He did not possess the frantic energy of a stranded traveler. He sat with the relaxed posture of a man accustomed to waiting for bureaucrats to finish stamping his paperwork. He stood up and walked over to my table. Officer Voss looked up, opening her mouth to ask him to return to his designated waiting area, but the man raised a hand. It was a simple, polite gesture that somehow carried enough authority to make the Dutch officer pause. He pulled out the metal chair next to mine and sat down. He did not introduce himself right away. He kept his voice low-pitched, just under the hum of the fluorescent lights, speaking directly to me. "Who held the passport?" he asked. I stiffened. I pulled my carry-on bag an inch closer to my knees. You do not survive in international logistics by divulging personal vulnerabilities to strangers in secondary inspection rooms. I am currently filing a report with the officer, I said, keeping my tone guarded. He ignored my deflection. Who benefits from you being stuck in this room for the next 48 hours? My heart did a strange, uncomfortable stutter. I stared at him, trying to read his face. He was not prying for gossip. He was asking targeted operational questions, the exact kind of questions I asked when auditing a compromised supply chain. Before I could formulate a safe response, he leaned in a fraction of an inch closer and delivered the third strike. "Does your name appear on any trade papers you did not sign?" The air left my lungs. The entire confusing narrative of the morning, the stolen wallet, the charging phone, my mother's sudden lie to the transit desk, Mallory's smug wave suddenly aligned into a cold, terrifying pattern. I gripped the handle of my bag so tightly my knuckles ached. He had just articulated the exact nightmare scenario forming in the back of my mind. "My name is Victor Langford," he said quietly. "Langford Maritime Group." The name registered immediately. Langford Maritime operated a massive share of the container terminals in Puget Sound. He was a shipping magnate deeply embedded in Washington state commerce. He knew the trade industry inside and out, which meant he knew exactly what a stolen compliance identity could be used for. He leaned back in his metal chair, his demeanor remaining entirely unruffled. My corporate aircraft is currently grounded on the tarmac outside because of a routing discrepancy in our flight logs. I have been sitting here listening to your mother's fabricated story filter through the border officers. And then I heard you." Victor gestured slightly toward the door. "Pretend you are with my team. My jet is waiting, but more importantly, my attorney is already here. They will regret making this sloppy." I sat frozen in the hard plastic chair. I despise public scenes. My entire childhood was spent avoiding the messy, loud dramas my sister created and my parents enabled. I built a life based on self-reliance because needing help in my family always came with a crushing, manipulative invoice. Accepting a lifeline from a billionaire stranger in a European detention center felt dangerously close to a loss of control. But my parents had already stripped my control. They had taken my documents and left me to panic. Sitting in the sterile airport room, a sharp, bitter realization settled over me. Trusting a wealthy maritime executive I had known for exactly 3 minutes felt substantially safer than calling the people who shared my last name. I nodded once. A short, decisive acceptance of the alliance. Victor did not offer a comforting hug or a sympathetic platitude. He offered process. He pulled a sleek smartphone from his jacket pocket and tapped a single button. Less than a minute later, the heavy door to the inspection room opened again. A woman in her late 40s strode in. She wore a sharp black trench coat and carried a thick leather briefcase. She bypassed the waiting passengers and walked straight to our table. "June Callahan," Victor said, introducing her. "My general counsel." June did not waste time on pleasantries. She assessed my missing documents, my posture, and Officer Voss sitting across the table. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a fresh legal pad. "We have a situation," Victor told her. "This is Isabella Hart. She is an international trade compliance specialist operating out of Seattle. Her family removed her travel documents and communication devices prior to boarding, rendering her temporarily undocumented." June looked at me, her eyes sharp and analytical. "Are you named as the importer of record on any pending cargo releases back in Washington?" "I might be." I said, the reality of my sister's boutique launch forming a heavy knot in my stomach. My sister was struggling with import filings for a new shipment. We fought over it. Now my passport is on a plane to Seattle. June turned immediately to Officer Voss. She did not demand my release or threaten international lawsuits. June operated within the firm boundaries of American realism. You cannot simply whisk an undocumented citizen onto a private jet and bypass international borders regardless of how much money you possess. The laws apply, and identity verification is mandatory. Instead, June weaponized the bureaucracy. Officer Voss June said producing her own identification credentials. "My client, Ms. Hart, is an emergency trade consultant acting in an advisory capacity for our maritime operations. Her documentation was unlawfully removed by her travel companions. We are requesting immediate consular support to verify her identity so she can resume her professional duties." Officer Voss blinked, looking between the intimidating corporate lawyer, the billionaire sitting calmly in the metal chair, and me. The narrative my mother had planted, the story of a frantic, unstable daughter throwing a tantrum, completely evaporated. Unstable tourists do not have general counsel stepping in to manage their consular transfers. Voss nodded, picking up her radio. "I will contact the United States consulate in Amsterdam. They will need to run her biometrics and issue an emergency passport before we can release her." "Thank you," June replied. She pulled a secondary mobile device from her briefcase, a secure temporary phone, and set it on the table in front of me. She placed a steaming paper cup of black coffee right beside it. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup. The bitter coffee was the first tether I had to reality since my father pocketed my wallet. Victor and June had not rescued me from the red tape, but they had fundamentally shifted the power dynamic in the room. I was no longer an isolated target. I was a professional with advocates. Victor checked his watch. "The consulate will take a few hours. We need to figure out what your sister is moving through the port before you get on a plane." I picked up the secure phone. The screen glowed, waiting for a prompt. I had no access to my personal contacts, but I knew my corporate login credentials by heart. If Mallory was using my name to bypass customs regulations, the paper trail would be sitting in my work inbox. June pulled a pen from her briefcase and clicked it open. She leaned forward, her expression entirely focused on the mechanics of the potential fraud. "Before you log in, June," said her voice lowering to ensure the border guards could not overhear, "I need to know exactly how exposed you are. Did your family have access to your social security number and your old passport scans?" I stared at June Callahan, processing the terrifying implications of her question. Did my family have access to my sensitive documents? I thought about the boxes of old tax returns and college scholarship applications stored in my childhood bedroom back in Spokane. I thought about how often my parents blurred the lines of privacy, always demanding transparency from me while shielding Mallory from any real scrutiny. "Yes," I told June, my voice barely above a whisper. My mother kept a file cabinet in her home office. It had copies of my first passport and my original Social Security card. June nodded, her expression hardening. She pulled a secure tablet from her briefcase and unlocked the screen. "Log into your professional email," she instructed, sliding the device across the metal table. "Do not look for messages from your family. Look for automated notifications from customs brokers or shipping registries." My hands were shaking slightly as I typed my credentials into the secure portal. The familiar layout of my corporate inbox loaded onto the screen. I scrolled past the routine internal memos and compliance updates from my colleagues in Seattle. Then I saw it. It was an email sent early Friday morning Pacific time, just hours before our flight took off from Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The sender was a mid-level freight forwarding agency located near the port of Tacoma. The subject line read, "Urgent final confirmation for customs release. Hart Global Consulting / Boutique Inventory." The blood drained from my face, leaving my skin cold and clammy. I clicked the email, opening the message thread. The broker was requesting final authorization to clear a massive shipment of imported luxury goods. The cargo was flagged for Mallory's new brand launch, but the importer of record, the legal entity claiming total responsibility for the contents, the tariffs, and the compliance codes, was not Mallory. It was a company called Hart Global Consulting. I had never formed an LLC. I had never registered a consulting firm. I worked as a salaried employee for a logistics corporation. My name had been weaponized. I stared at the glowing screen, the physical reality of the betrayal settling heavy in my chest. They did not just abandon me at an airport because they were annoyed with my compliance lectures. They orchestrated this entire European vacation to ensure I was physically incapable of intercepting a shipment bearing my name. They stole my passport to buy themselves a window of time. My sister had spent her entire life skating by on charm and the endless financial padding our parents provided. She was the creative visionary. I was the boring rule follower. Whenever I tried to inject reality into her chaotic business plans, she would roll her eyes and dismiss me. I remembered her standing in my Seattle apartment a month ago, holding a stack of fabric swatches, while I tried to explain the severe penalties for mislabeling commercial imports. She had swatted the warning away with a careless wave of her manicured hand. "Paperwork is not a personality, Izzy," she had sneered, packing up her samples. She was right. Paperwork was not a personality, it was a federal liability, and she had just dumped all of it directly onto my shoulders. I did not panic. The initial shock mutated rapidly into a cold clinical focus. My occupation trained me to look at disasters as a series of data points requiring containment. I tapped the screen, highlighting the email thread from the Tacoma freight forwarder. I forwarded the entire chain to a secure encrypted folder June generated on the tablet. I did not reply to the broker. If I tipped my hand now, alerting the forwarding agency that the importer of record was currently detained in a Dutch secondary inspection room, my family would immediately realize the trap had failed. I needed them to believe I was still isolated and helpless. Next, I accessed a temporary banking portal through the tablet. I entered my corporate identification numbers and initiated a hard freeze on the company credit card Mallory had supposedly borrowed to buy coffee before the security checkpoint. The card was now useless plastic. My family had officially lost the advantage of total isolation. I was establishing a perimeter from 4,000 miles away. Victor watched me work his silver hair, catching the harsh fluorescent light. He noted the speed and precision of my actions. "You understand what happens if that freight clears customs under your name," he said, his voice steady and pragmatic. "I understand," I replied, keeping my eyes on the screen reviewing the attached shipping manifests. "If the contents are misclassified, or if she is importing counterfeit inventory, the federal penalties fall on the registered importer." My career is over. I could face criminal charges. My expertise allowed me to identify the mismatched company name and spot the urgent release request, but my knowledge had a hard boundary. I could read the automated notifications, but I could not access the actual cargo logs. I had no idea what was inside those shipping containers. I only knew that whatever Mallory had purchased, she was too terrified to put her own name on the paperwork. The emotional gravity of the situation pressed down on me. My parents had looked me in the eye, packed their suitcases, and walked away knowing they were leaving me to take the fall for a federal crime. They had used the person I had worked so hard to become to shield the daughter who refused to grow up. I scrolled down to the bottom of the broker's email, searching for the critical data point that would dictate the timeline of my survival. I found the logistics schedule buried beneath the broker's electronic signature block. The hold was temporary. The paperwork was moving through the automated commercial environment. The email confirmed the specific window of vulnerability. The shipment was scheduled for mandatory release at the Port of Tacoma on Monday morning at 8 a.m. Pacific Time. The waiting area inside the United States Consulate in Amsterdam offered a slightly warmer environment than the airport holding room, but the underlying tension remained thick. I sat on a blue upholstered chair, watching the heavy wooden door leading to the consular duty officer's desk. June sat beside me, her fingers flying across the screen of the secure tablet, drafting formal affidavits and securing electronic communications. Victor had stayed behind at the airport, monitoring the status of his grounded aircraft, ensuring we had a guaranteed extraction method the moment my identity was verified. The physical exhaustion of the red-eye flight and the emotional whiplash of the abandonment were beginning to settle deep into my bones. The adrenaline that fueled my initial discovery of the fraudulent emails was fading, leaving a dull, throbbing headache in its wake. My parents and my sister were currently flying 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, entirely confident that their plan was unfolding flawlessly. They assumed I was sitting in a European detention center, sobbing and paralyzed by the social embarrassment of being undocumented. They counted on my lifelong aversion to making a scene, assuming the shame of the situation would keep me silent until Monday morning. The heavy wooden door opened. The consular duty officer, a man with graying temples and a crisp white shirt, stepped into the waiting area holding a thin stack of printed documents. He looked at me, offering a professional, reassuring nod. He gestured for June and me to follow him back into his office. Marieke Vos, the Dutch border officer who had originally detained me, was standing near the window. She had accompanied me to the consulate to facilitate the transfer of jurisdiction. Her posture had shifted considerably since our first encounter. The cautious, suspicious glare she had worn when my mother's fabricated story of mental instability governed the narrative had dissolved. The consular officer sat down behind his heavy oak desk, spreading the papers out. "We have verified your identity, Ms. Hart," he stated, tapping a pen against the printed confirmation of my passport number. "The biometrics match the federal database, and Ms. Callahan has provided a sworn statement detailing the removal of your documents. You are a recognized United States citizen." I let out a slow, shaky exhale. The tight knot in my chest loosened a fraction. I was no longer a ghost trapped in a bureaucratic void. I existed again on paper. Marieke stepped forward, her hands clasped behind her back. Her expression was solemn, carrying a quiet, professional apology. "I have updated the incident log," she said, her accented English soft but firm. "We have formally recorded the removal of your passport and personal devices as a theft committed by your travel companions." She paused, looking at me with a steady, perceptive gaze. "When your mother approached the transit desk, she painted a very specific picture. She described someone prone to erratic outbursts and deep confusion." Marieke offered a small, tight smile. "Your mother's description does not match your behavior, Ms. Hart." The validation from a stranger struck a deep, resonant chord within me. For my entire life, my mother had controlled the narrative. If I was organized, I was deemed rigid. If I was cautious about Mallory's chaotic business plans, I was labeled jealous and unsupportive. Carol had always possessed the power to define my reality to the outside world. But sitting in that consular office thousands of miles from Seattle, a foreign border guard looked at the evidence and chose to believe the daughter instead of the mother. A stranger saw my competence before my own family ever did. I did not let the emotional relief distract me from the tactical requirements of the situation. I needed to solidify the boundary my parents had forced upon me. I picked up a pen from the desk and signed the formal emergency passport statement. I filled out the stolen document report, detailing exactly what Dennis and Carol had taken. I was correcting my initial mistake. I would never again allow my father to hold my travel wallet under the guise of family convenience. I officially severed my identity from their possession. Next, I requested the use of the consular phone line. I dialed the international customer service number for the airline we had booked for our return flights. I navigated the automated menus until I reached a human representative. I provided my booking reference and explicitly removed my name from the shared family itinerary. I marked my reservation as traveling independently, ensuring Dennis could not manipulate my seating or attempt to cancel my ticket to further delay my return. I hung up the receiver, feeling a profound sense of agency returning to my fingertips. I had secured a lawful path back to the United States. I had a temporary phone, an emergency passport printed on thin paper, and the legal recognition of my identity. But the victory was only partial. The consular systems had validated my existence, but they could not stop a commercial freight release at the port of Tacoma. An emergency passport grants you the right to cross a border. It does not grant you the authority to freeze an automated federal supply chain. I was still operating on a severe deficit. I had no luggage, no permanent phone, and no access to the physical import documents required to halt Mallory's shipment. My parents still held the advantage of time and physical proximity to the cargo. June closed the cover of her tablet, her sharp eyes scanning the documents I had just signed. "You have your mobility back," she noted, packing her briefcase. "But we need to understand exactly how deeply your sister entrenched your name into this operation before we land in Washington." I nodded, following her out of the consular office and back into the waiting area. My mind was already racing ahead, calculating the compliance risks associated with the Monday morning release window. If Mallory had listed me as the importer of record, she must have forged a customs power of attorney. She needed my authorized signature to legally bind me to the freight forwarder. While we waited for the final bureaucratic stamps on the emergency travel document, June opened her tablet again, connecting to the secure consulate wireless network. She accessed the Washington Secretary of State Business Registry database. She needed to establish the timeline of the fraud. I watched over her shoulder as the search results loaded onto the screen. The registration details for Hart Global Consulting appeared in stark black and white text. June traced her finger along the filing date listed at the top of the digital form. Her jaw tightened. She looked up at me, the severity of the situation reflecting in her expression. "Isabella," June said, her voice dropping to a low, serious pitch. "Look at the registration timeline." I leaned closer, focusing on the date. The LLC had been formally incorporated and registered with the state exactly 3 days before our flight departed from Seattle. The chilling reality of the timeline settled over me. This was not a last-minute, desperate decision made by a struggling boutique owner. This was a meticulously planned corporate identity theft. They had established the fraudulent company, filed the necessary state paperwork, and initiated the international freight transfer, all before my mother even suggested the family healing trip to Europe. The vacation was never about reconciliation. It was an elaborate, carefully staged alibi designed to ensure the registered agent of Hart Global Consulting was conveniently unreachable when the cargo hit the Tacoma docks. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold, hard anger eclipse the lingering exhaustion of the red-eye flight. My family had spent weeks smiling at me across dinner tables discussing flight itineraries and hotel bookings, all while secretly building a financial trapdoor beneath my feet. But the registration document revealed one more detail that shifted the entire landscape of the impending confrontation. June tapped the screen, highlighting the primary operating address listed for the fraudulent LLC. She looked at me, waiting for the realization to hit. "They did not just use your name," June observed quietly. "They needed a physical location to legitimize the commercial entity." The interior of the Langford Maritime corporate aircraft was a study in quiet efficiency. Deep leather seats faced polished walnut tables, and the faint scent of fresh coffee masked the smell of jet fuel from the tarmac outside. We were still grounded in Amsterdam, waiting for the final clearance protocols to align with my newly issued emergency passport. I sat across from Victor, looking down at the tablet resting between us. The Washington Business Registry page for Hart Global Consulting glowed on the screen. The registered agent was a cheap automated online legal service, confirming Mallory had outsourced the actual incorporation process to avoid interacting with a real attorney. But the physical operating address listed on the state filing was not a post office box or a generic commercial suite. It was my exact apartment number in downtown Seattle. They had anchored the fraudulent company directly to my living room. If federal customs agents ever decided to execute an unannounced site visit to audit the importer of record, they would knock on my front door. My phone, the secure temporary device June had provided, buzzed sharply against the walnut table. I glanced at the screen, expecting another automated customs alert, but it was not for me. Victor picked up his own phone, examining the caller ID before answering. He kept the call on speakerphone, resting the device on the table. It was his compliance director calling from the Tacoma Port Operations Center. The man's voice carried the clipped, urgent cadence of someone managing a massive logistics network. "Mr. Langford," the director reported over the slight static of the international connection. "We flagged the routing codes on the incoming freight you asked us to monitor. The cargo manifested under Hart Global Consulting is scheduled for discharge on Monday morning. The broker filed the entry paperwork late Thursday night." Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "And the storage destination?" he asked, his voice perfectly level. The director hesitated for a fraction of a second. "The delivery orders specify immediate transfer to our primary bonded warehouse in Tacoma. The importer claims they have an established receiving contract with Langford Maritime." Victor did not raise his voice. He did not slam his hand against the table. But the atmosphere inside the cabin chilled instantly. His expression hardened, the relaxed demeanor of a wealthy traveler vanishing, entirely replaced by the ruthless focus of a maritime CEO whose corporate security had just been breached. He ended the call and looked across the table at me. He did not look at me with pity. He looked at me as a colleague navigating a shared crisis. "Your sister did not just use you," Victor stated, the words dropping like heavy stones into the quiet cabin. "She borrowed my reputation, too." The implication hit me with staggering force. A bonded warehouse is a highly secure, federally regulated facility where imported goods can be stored without immediate payment of duties. To list a Langford Maritime bonded facility as the intended storage destination, Mallory was signaling to customs officials that her new company had the financial backing and logistical approval of one of the largest shipping conglomerates on the West Coast. She was using Victor's pristine corporate standing to rubber stamp her own questionable inventory. The betrayal had expanded far beyond a family dispute. My parents and my sister had not just thrown my career onto the tracks to protect Mallory's boutique. They had actively jeopardized a multi-billion-dollar maritime operation, meticulously orchestrating the paperwork to ensure the cargo looked untouchable to federal inspectors. They had endangered a stranger's company far more carefully than they had ever considered my own safety. Our interests were now completely aligned. I was fighting to clear my name from a fraudulent LLC, and Victor was fighting to protect his bonded warehouse from unauthorized federal liability. I looked at Victor, meeting his sharp, assessing gaze. "I need you to lock down your receiving docks," I requested, keeping my tone strictly operational. "Contact your warehouse managers right now. Instruct them not to accept any freight transfer tied to Hart Global Consulting without direct verbal confirmation from your compliance director. We need to build a hard stop into the physical delivery chain before Monday morning." Victor nodded, reaching for his phone to issue the lockdown orders. It was a moment of profound validation. He did not dismiss my request as the frantic demands of a stressed traveler. He recognized the compliance strategy and respected my expertise executing the command immediately. June, however, raised a hand signaling caution. She possessed the analytical restraint of a seasoned corporate attorney. Isabella June began, her voice measured and precise. Victor is securing the warehouse perimeter, but you need to manage your expectations regarding the customs release. We can stop the physical storage, but we cannot officially kill the freight entry until we see the underlying paperwork. Your anger is entirely justified, but it is premature to make formal public accusations of fraud to Customs and Border Protection without reviewing the actual broker filings. I felt a surge of defensive frustration tighten my chest. They stole my passport, June, I argued, my voice rising slightly. They registered a fake company to my apartment and lied to border police to trap me here. The intent is obvious. June did not back down. Intent is a theory, she countered calmly. Signatures are evidence. Until we can prove that Mallory or your parents unlawfully authorized the broker to act on your behalf, we are just operating on very suspicious timing. If you alert CBP without the documents, you risk triggering a messy, broad investigation that could freeze your legitimate career assets while they sort out the mess. We need the power of attorney. I forced myself to absorb her logic. She was right. My occupation trained me to understand the severe risk of crying wolf to federal agencies. If I screamed fraud without the specific contract tying my name to the broker, I would sound exactly like the hysterical daughter my mother had described to the Dutch police. I needed the smoking gun. The airport trap had been perfectly timed to keep me isolated while the broker processed the entry. They assumed I would be stuck in a European holding cell without a phone, unable to access the automated commercial environment to review the filings. But my family did not know I had returned. They did not know I was sitting on a corporate jet with a secure tablet and an emergency passport preparing to fly back to Seattle before the sun rose on Monday morning. June picked up the tablet, tapping rapidly across the screen. She accessed the secure folder where we had forwarded the initial broker emails. She navigated through the attached PDF files, bypassing the standard commercial invoices and packing lists. She opened the final attachment. It was the Customs Power of Attorney, the legally binding document that grants a broker the authority to clear freight through federal borders on behalf of an importer. June turned the tablet around and slid it across the walnut table toward me. I looked down at the bright screen. Staring back at me from the bottom of the authorized signature line was my own name. The name stared back at me from the bright screen of the tablet. Isabella Hart. The cursive loops were smooth, forming a signature that looked incredibly authentic at first glance. It was positioned directly beneath a terrifying legal declaration asserting my full liability as the authorized officer for Hart Global Consulting. To a busy customs broker processing hundreds of entries a day, it would pass without a second thought. But to the woman whose hand supposedly wrote it, the subtle, unnatural stiffness in the letters was glaringly obvious. It was a tracing, an exceptionally good one, but a tracing nonetheless. I leaned closer, zooming in on the image of the power of attorney document. The lowercase letters dragged slightly, lacking the fluid speed of my actual handwriting. It was an exact replica of the signature I used when I was 18 years old. I recognized the distinct, rigid style immediately. It was the signature I had used to sign dozens of college scholarship applications and my first adult passport application before I left home for Seattle. My mother, Carol, kept all of those old documents meticulously filed away in a heavy metal cabinet in my childhood bedroom back in Spokane. She had weaponized her own meticulous record-keeping, turning the very papers that launched my independence into the tools required to steal it back. The realization stung with a sharp, deeply personal ache. My childhood records, the evidence of my hard work, had literally become the instruments used to bind me to a federal liability. A memory surfaced, uninvited, breaking through my professional focus. I remembered sitting at the dining room table in Spokane the summer before my sophomore year of college. I had asked my father, Dennis, for a small loan to cover the cost of my textbooks for the upcoming semester. He had declined, citing the importance of financial independence and personal responsibility. Yet a week later, he happily wrote a massive check to fund Mallory's latest entrepreneurial whim. He paid for her boutique's initial website, design expensive ring lights, and professional brand photography so she could launch her social media presence. When I quietly pointed out the disparity, he had simply folded his newspaper and looked at me with cold dismissal. "Mallory has a vision," he had said, his voice devoid of any apology. "You have a job." That dynamic had governed our family for decades. Mallory was the investment. I was the utility. And now they had decided my utility included serving as the human shield for her latest vision. The lingering question, though, was the extent of my father's involvement in this specific forgery. Did Dennis know that Carol had pulled my old passport forms from the file cabinet to trace my signature? Did he actively participate in drafting the fraudulent power of attorney, or did he simply turn a blind eye, letting Carol and Mallory handle the dirty logistics while he focused on executing the physical abandonment at Schiphol Airport? I wanted to believe he was just a weak enabler, passively allowing his wife to orchestrate the crime, but the cruel efficiency with which he pocketed my passport earlier that morning suggested a deeper, darker complicity. I pushed the emotional turmoil aside. Wondering about my father's guilt would not stop the freight release. I needed to dismantle the legal trap they had set. I picked up the stylus attached to June's tablet. I did not draft a sweeping emotional letter to the authorities. I did not threaten massive lawsuits against my family. The customs officers at the Port of Tacoma deal strictly in facts and actionable compliance directives. Drama only slows down the bureaucratic machinery. June. I said, keeping my voice level and deliberate. I am going to highlight the specific inconsistencies in this signature. I need you to draft a concise one-page notice addressed directly to Customs and Border Protection. June watched me marking the digital document, nodding in agreement. "Keep it tight," she advised, pulling a fresh legal pad from her briefcase. "What are the specific declarations?" I dictated the facts with surgical precision. "State clearly that I, Isabella Hart, did not sign, authorize, or formally establish the entity known as Hart Global Consulting. State that the power of attorney presented by the broker is unauthorized and fraudulent. State that I am formally objecting to any cargo release executed under my name or my credentials." I was effectively cutting the legal tether between myself and Mallory's incoming inventory. It was a direct strike against the foundational paperwork required to move the freight. By submitting a formal objection regarding an unauthorized power of attorney, I was providing CBP with the exact justification they needed to halt the clearance process. However, my trade expertise also forced me to acknowledge the limitations of my current position. A signature dispute cannot be fully resolved while flying 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. The notice June was drafting would serve as a powerful warning flag, but until I stood in front of a federal officer and presented my emergency passport to verify my identity, the shipment remained dangerously close to the release window. I handed the tablet back to June. She quickly typed the formal notice incorporating my dictated statements into a clean, professional format. She did not ask me how it felt to see my mother's tracing on a federal document. She understood that we were operating in triage mode. We were sealing the hull breach before the ship sank. Victor, who had been quietly monitoring his own secure communication channels, looked up as June finalized the document. He had secured his bonded warehouse, closing the physical receiving doors to Mallory's freight, but he knew the cargo itself was still hurtling toward the Monday morning deadline. My flight crew just received the final clearance protocols. Victor announced, his voice breaking the tense silence in the cabin. "The routing discrepancy has been resolved. We are cleared for takeoff." I let out a slow, heavy breath. The sheer physical relief of knowing I was finally moving back toward my own life was profound. My parents had timed the airport abandonment perfectly, assuming the long international delay and the bureaucratic nightmare of securing a new passport would keep me trapped in Europe until long after Mallory's inventory cleared customs. They believed their stolen identity scheme was operating flawlessly, completely unaware that I had secured a lifeline and was actively severing their legal access to my name. Victor leaned forward, resting his hands on the polished walnut table. He looked at me with the quiet, intense focus of a man accustomed to executing high-stakes maneuvers. "We can land at Boeing Field just south of Seattle well before sunrise," Victor stated, outlining the logistical reality of our return. "If you want to go straight to the Port of Tacoma, we will have several hours to spare before the morning release window opens." I looked out the small oval window of the aircraft. The lights of the Amsterdam terminal were beginning to blur as the plane pushed back from the gate. My parents and my sister were somewhere out over the ocean, flying back to Washington, confident in their cruel victory. They thought they had left me with nothing. I turned back to Victor and nodded firmly. We go straight to Tacoma. The gray morning light over Puget Sound offered no warmth as Victor's private car pulled up to the Port of Tacoma Administration Building. The air smelled of diesel exhaust and salt water. Massive container cranes loomed in the distance, cutting jagged silhouettes against the low, overcast sky. I stepped out of the vehicle, the cold, damp air biting through my thin jacket. The physical exhaustion of the transatlantic flight and the relentless adrenaline of the past 24 hours sat heavy in my bones, but I pushed it down. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the Customs and Border Protection Field Office. June strode beside me, carrying her leather briefcase, projecting the quiet, unshakable authority of corporate counsel. I did not need to search for the right department. My career in trade compliance meant I knew exactly where to go and who to ask for. We approached the front counter. I requested an immediate meeting with the duty supervisor regarding a fraudulent power of attorney tied to an incoming commercial freight release. The desk agent noted the severity of my request and the presence of my attorney, asking us to wait in a small glass-walled conference room. 10 minutes later, a CBP supervisor named Nadine Ellison walked in. She wore the dark blue uniform of a federal officer, her expression sharp and strictly professional. She carried a printed copy of the one-page notice June had drafted on the flight over. Ms. Hart, Nadine said, sitting down across the narrow table. I have reviewed the objections submitted by your counsel regarding the entity known as Hart Global Consulting. This is a serious allegation. You are stating that the importer of record on a pending container release was established using your identity without your consent. I placed my newly issued emergency passport on the table, sliding it toward her. It was printed on thin, fragile paper, a stark contrast to the sturdy Navy booklet my father had stolen. Yes, Supervisor Ellison, I replied, my voice steady despite the deep fatigue pulling at the edges of my focus. I did not sign, authorize, or form that company. The customs power of attorney presented by the broker is unauthorized. My family members removed my original travel documents prior to boarding an international flight, deliberately stranding me in Amsterdam to ensure I was physically unavailable to contest this release. Nadine examined the emergency passport, checking the issuance stamps and the biometrics. She looked up, her gaze assessing me carefully. You understand that if we place a hard hold on this shipment pending a fraud investigation, it will not clear the port today. The cargo will be locked down. That is exactly what I am requesting, I stated firmly. The shipment cannot move under my authority. Before Nadine could respond, the conference room door opened. A man in his early 40s, wearing a slightly wrinkled suit, stepped inside. He looked harassed and out of breath, holding a thick stack of commercial invoices. I recognized him from the email signature block. He was the freight forwarder Mallory had hired to process the entry. He stopped short, seeing me sitting across from the CBP supervisor. He glanced from me to Nadine, his confusion rapidly mutating into defensive frustration. Ms. Hart, he said, running a hand through his thinning hair. I have been trying to reach you all weekend. We have the trucks lined up for the transfer to the Langford bonded warehouse. We need to finalize the clearance immediately, or your sister is going to miss her entire launch schedule tonight. I did not stand up. I did not offer a polite greeting. I am not the importer of record, I told him clearly. You are operating on a fraudulent power of attorney. I have formally objected to the release. The broker stared at me, his frustration boiling over. He slapped his stack of invoices down on the table. Look, he snapped, leaning forward. I do not have time for internal family drama. Your sister assured me you approved all of this. She paid the processing fees. She said you were handling the compliance side of the boutique. He pointed a finger at me, his voice rising with the stress of the impending deadline. Your sister warned me you would do this. She said you were impossible to deal with, but that you would fold if the clock got tight. She said you always cave when the pressure is on. The blunt assessment hit me like a physical blow. Mallory had not just stolen my identity. She had weaponized my entire personality, assuming my lifelong habit of avoiding conflict would guarantee her success. She had told a stranger, a federal customs broker, that I was weak. She banked her entire fraudulent enterprise on the belief that I lacked the spine to stand up to my own family when the stakes were high. I felt a sudden violent surge of anger rising in my chest. The exhaustion and the betrayal threatened to overwhelm my professional restraint. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to yell that my family had abandoned me in a foreign country and that my sister was a manipulative thief. I took a sharp breath, gripping the edge of the table, forcing myself to regain control. Shouting would only make me look unstable, validating the narrative my mother had planted at the airport. I needed to remain cold and factual. "I am not folding," I said, my voice dropping to a low, uncompromising pitch. "I did not sign those documents. The Langford Maritime Warehouse has already been notified, and they have formally refused acceptance of this freight." The broker's face drained of color. He looked at June, who simply nodded, confirming the warehouse rejection. He realized instantly that his cargo was stranded. Without an authorized importer of record and without a designated storage facility, the shipment was dead in the water. Nadine Ellison picked up her pen. She had heard enough. She did not care about the family dynamics or the boutique launch schedule. She cared about the integrity of the federal border. "The release is suspended," Nadine announced, writing a swift, decisive note across the top of the broker's paperwork. "The cargo will remain under CBP hold, pending a full review of the contested power of attorney. No freight will move." The broker groaned, burying his face in his hands, realizing he was now caught in the middle of a massive federal liability. He gathered his useless invoices and hurried out of the conference room, desperately dialing his phone, likely trying to reach Mallory to deliver the catastrophic news. I sat back in my chair, the rigid tension in my spine releasing slightly. I had done it. I had beaten the clock. The immediate threat of the fraudulent cargo clearing customs under my name was stopped. Mallory's launch inventory was securely trapped behind a federal barricade. My family's carefully orchestrated plan to use my identity and my compliance record to shield her imports had completely failed. I thanked Nadine and walked out of the administration building with June. The gray morning air felt slightly cleaner. I had finally prevented myself from being used as the fall person. My parents had timed the abandonment perfectly, hoping my absence would ensure the release, but they did not anticipate my return. I pulled my temporary phone from my jacket pocket, intending to check the time before asking June to drop me at my apartment. The screen illuminated, flooding my hand with the harsh glare of a dozen new notifications. The messages were not automated customs alerts. They were a barrage of text messages from various extended family members, cousins, aunts, and my mother, Carol. I opened the first message from my mother, feeling the cold, damp chill of the port seep back into my bones. Carol had not waited to see if the shipment cleared. She had already launched the contingency plan. The text read, "You made us look like criminals at the airport. Now you are parading around Europe with some old rich man while your sister's business is on the line. Fix this before Mallory's launch tonight." The digital onslaught did not stop with my mother's message. As I sat in the leather passenger seat of Victor's idling car, watching the container cranes disappear in the rearview mirror, my temporary phone vibrated with a rapid succession of incoming texts. The relief I felt inside the customs office evaporated instantly. My family had realized the shipment was stuck, and they were deploying their secondary weapon. They could not force the release through federal channels, so they were attempting to force my compliance through social execution. I opened a message from my cousin Clara. "Are you seriously sleeping with that shipping man?" The text read, the words burning against the screen. "Aunt Carol said you threw a massive tantrum at the airport because you met someone online and refused to get on the flight. She says you abandoned the family to run off with some old rich guy." My stomach twisted with a sharp, sickening knot. Carol had not just planted a story about mental instability with the Dutch police. She had crafted a deeply humiliating, highly sexualized narrative for the extended family back in Seattle. She was actively twisting the nightmare of my abandonment, painting my desperate reliance on Victor's professional assistance as a scandalous, illicit affair. She was shaming me, punishing me for surviving her trap. Another notification popped up. It was an alert from Instagram. Mallory had posted a new story to her boutique's launch page, which already had several thousand followers. The post was a sleek, stylized graphic with elegant typography set against a blush pink background. It read, "There is a special kind of sadness reserved for women who weaponize compliance because they are incapable of building anything beautiful themselves. Stay tuned for our launch tonight despite the jealousy." Mallory was broadcasting my supposed interference to her entire customer base. She was framing my refusal to accept federal liability for her forged documents as an act of petty, vindictive sabotage. But the final message, the one that truly terrified me, came directly from Carol. It was short and ruthless. "Your father spoke with Elaine Porter this morning. You made us look like criminals. Fix this before Mallory's launch tonight, or we will ensure your firm knows exactly how you treat your own blood." Elaine Porter was the managing director of my logistics division. She was my direct supervisor. Dennis had called my workplace. The strategy was brutally transparent. Because I had successfully stopped the shipment at the port, my family was actively threatening my professional reputation to force a public retraction. They assumed my lifelong terror of public embarrassment and my fierce dedication to my career would compel me to surrender. They wanted me to call Customs and Border Protection, withdraw my fraud complaint, and quietly authorize the release to save my job. I did not wait to see if Dennis's poison had taken root. I pulled up the dial pad and called Elaine's direct line. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm as the line trilled. If my father convinced my employer that I was mixing volatile family business with corporate accounts, I could lose my position before I even returned to the office. Isabella Elaine answered, her voice crisp and professional, though edged with a slight undertone of concern. "I was just reviewing my voicemails. I received a very unusual message from your father regarding your sister's import filings." I cut straight to the facts, avoiding the emotional snare my family had set. "Elaine, I apologize for the disruption," I stated, keeping my tone steady and analytical. "My family intentionally removed my travel documents at Schiphol Airport to delay my return. While I was securing an emergency passport, they utilized a forged customs power of attorney to list me as the importer of record on a commercial freight release scheduled for this morning in Tacoma." The line went silent for a brief moment as Elaine processed the severity of the allegation. She was a seasoned logistics director. She understood exactly what a forged POA implied. "Are you currently liable for the cargo?" Elaine asked, her focus immediately shifting to the legal exposure. "No," I replied. "I am currently leaving the CBP field office in Tacoma. I submitted a formal objection, and the shipment has been placed under a hard federal hold. I am forwarding you the stolen document report from the consulate and the redacted notice I provided to the Port Authority." My father's phone call was a preemptive attempt to discredit me because I refused to authorize their fraudulent clearance. I listened to the soft tapping of Elaine's keyboard as she received the encrypted files I sent from the tablet. She reviewed the documents, her silence offering a brief protective barrier against the chaos my family was generating. Elaine was pragmatic. She believed the paperwork because the paperwork did not lie. "I see the notice, Isabella," she finally said, her voice softening slightly. "The firm is insulated and your position here is secure. We deal in facts, not family gossip." The immediate relief was profound, but Elaine's next words tempered it with a heavy dose of reality. However, she cautioned, "You need to be careful about how this plays out locally. Your sister's launch event is highly publicized in Bellevue tonight. If this escalates into a public screaming match at a venue full of local vendors and buyers, it will look incredibly messy for you as a compliance professional. Being legally right does not always protect you from looking unstable in the court of public opinion." I thanked her and ended the call, staring out the rain-streaked window of the car. Elaine was right. The paperwork protected my employment, but it offered no shelter from the relentless social smear campaign my family was orchestrating. I mistakenly assumed that proving the fraud to the federal authorities would instantly quiet the gossip. I believed the cold hard facts would force my parents to retreat. But my family did not care about federal facts. They cared about the narrative. They were doubling down using my stranded rescue against me, turning my survival into a scandalous rumor to ensure the extended family and Mallory's social circle viewed me as the villain. Victor, who had been driving in silence navigating the heavy Seattle morning traffic, glanced over at me. "You secured your job," he noted accurately, reading the tension radiating from my posture. "But they are still controlling the room. They are trying to force me to fold before the launch party tonight," I admitted, scrolling through the toxic messages still flooding my screen. "They want me to absorb the blame for the delayed inventory." My phone buzzed again, demanding my attention. It was a new text message from Mallory. The notification preview displayed a long block of text. I opened the message. It was not an apology, it was a drafted statement. Mallory had typed out a formal public apology and demanded I post it to my own social media accounts and read it aloud to the vendors at her launch party that evening. The statement read, "I want to publicly apologize to Heart and Veil for the logistical delays regarding their highly anticipated inventory. Due to severe travel stress and exhaustion during my recent trip to Europe, I misunderstood the routine import paperwork and mistakenly halted the release. I fully support my sister's brand and take full responsibility for my own confusion." I stared at the screen, the sheer audacity of the demand stealing the breath from my lungs. They did not just want me to authorize the forged documents. They wanted me to publicly confess to being an incompetent, hysterical woman who ruined her sister's business out of travel fatigue. They wanted me to read a script that perfectly aligned with the lie Carol had told the Dutch border police. The air inside my Seattle apartment felt unnaturally still when I finally unlocked the door. I dropped my small carry-on bag onto the hardwood floor and stood in the quiet entryway. I was physically home, but the safety of my own space was completely compromised. The walls offered no protection from the digital assault, still waiting on the screen of my temporary phone. I walked into the kitchen and sat on a stool at the island, staring at the drafted statement Mallory had texted me. She wanted me to broadcast my own incompetence. She wanted me to stand in front of her vendors, her buyers, and her friends, and validate the exact lie my mother had told the Dutch authorities. I misunderstood routine import paperwork due to travel stress. Reading those words felt like swallowing broken glass. If I posted that statement, I would permanently attach a confession of professional negligence to my name. My career in trade compliance relies entirely on meticulous accuracy and strict adherence to federal regulations. You do not survive in logistics if you publicly admit that simple travel exhaustion causes you to mistakenly halt a commercial freight release. Mallory was asking me to drink career poison simply to save her launch party. The phone vibrated loudly against the granite countertop, vibrating with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed my father's number. I took a steadying breath, tapping the screen to answer, and placed the device on speakerphone. I needed my hands free to brace myself against the counter. "Isabella, my father." Dennis barked, his voice devoid of any greeting. It carried the booming, authoritative tone he used to end arguments before they even began. I heard the faint, ambient noise of a busy room in the background, the clinking of glasses, and the low murmur of conversations. They were likely already at the rooftop venue in Bellevue, preparing for the evening launch. I received the text I stated, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "I am not reading that statement, Dennis. I am not posting a fabricated confession." A sharp scoff echoed through the speaker. "It was my mother, Carol. We are trying to offer you a graceful exit, Isabella." She interjected, her voice dripping with condescending patience. "We gave you the opportunity to smooth this over quickly. Do not make this harder than it already is." I gripped the edge of the granite counter. "You abandoned me at an airport," I reminded them, fighting to keep the tremor out of my voice. "You took my passport and left me stranded so you could forge a power of attorney. And now you expect me to apologize for stopping you. That is your sister's livelihood sitting in a container at the port." Dennis snapped, his anger flaring at the direct accusation. He completely ignored the reality of his own actions, pivoting immediately to protect the golden child. "You threw a tantrum over paperwork, and you locked down her entire inventory." He paused, the line crackling with static, before delivering the ultimatum. "If you do not walk into this venue tonight and read that statement to her buyers, we will make sure every customs broker in Washington knows you destroy family businesses. We will tell everyone in the industry that you are a vindictive liability who weaponizes federal holds to settle petty personal grievances." The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. He was doubling down on the smear campaign, willing to scorch my professional earth to ensure Mallory suffered no consequences. Before I could process the sheer cruelty of his words, Mallory's voice broke through the background noise. She leaned close to the phone, her tone sharp and unyielding. "You owe me tonight, Izzy," she demanded, the nickname sounding like a curse. "You owe me an explanation in front of my guests. You already ruined my shipment. The least you can do is fix my reputation before the buyers leave. They were demanding a public surrender. They wanted to parade me in front of the Bellevue crowd as the contrite, unstable sister who finally realized her mistake." I stared at the speakerphone, the exhaustion blurring the edges of my rational judgment. My occupation trained me to manage commercial crises with cold, hard documentation. But the emotional ambush of my family triggered a different, deeply ingrained response. I hated public scenes. I spent my entire life avoiding the messy, loud dramas my parents created. The thought of them shouting accusations at me in a crowded venue surrounded by industry professionals terrified me. I made a calculation rooted in my oldest flaw. I thought if I could just get them away from the crowd, if I could look my father in the eye without an audience, he might finally understand the severity of the federal crime they had committed. I still harbored the dangerous, naive hope that a private conversation could break through their delusion. "I am not reading the statement," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "But I will come to the venue early. I will meet you before the launch party starts. We are going to talk privately first." A heavy silence followed. Then Dennis cleared his throat, a sound of grim satisfaction. "Fine. Be here at 6 o'clock. Do not be late." The line clicked dead. I lowered my head, resting my forehead against the cool granite countertop. I had secured a private meeting, but I immediately felt a profound, sickening doubt settling in my stomach. A sharp knock at my front door made me jump. I walked over and looked through the peephole. Naomi Price, my coworker and closest friend in Seattle, was standing in the hallway holding a large paper cup of coffee. I unlocked the door and pulled her inside. I had texted her a brief summary of the Schiphol abandonment from Victor's jet, and she had insisted on checking on me the moment I arrived home. Naomi took one look at my pale face and the secure phone resting on the kitchen island. "What did you just do?" she asked, handing me the warm coffee. I took a slow sip, the caffeine offering a small jolt of energy. "They want me to read a public apology at Mallory's launch tonight, claiming I halted the shipment because I was confused by travel stress," I explained, leaning against the island. "Dennis threatened to tell every broker in the state that I sabotage family businesses if I refuse. I told them I would meet them early to talk privately." Naomi's expression hardened. She set her bag down on the floor, crossing her arms over her chest. She possessed the sharp, intuitive instincts of a woman who had navigated her own toxic family dynamics. "Isabella," Naomi said, her voice firm and uncompromising, "you do not negotiate with terrorists in private. You just agreed to walk into another airport." I shook my head, defending my decision. "I cannot fight them in front of a room full of buyers, Naomi. It will be a bloodbath. If I can just get Dennis alone before the guests arrive, I can show him the hold notice. I can prove to him that CBP is reviewing the power of attorney. If he sees the actual federal documents, he might back down." "He did not care about federal documents when he pocketed your passport," Naomi countered bluntly. "He does not care about the law. He cares about control. You are hoping for a rational conversation with people who deliberately stranded you on another continent." She walked closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. Her gaze was intense, demanding I see the reality of the trap I was walking into. "If you go," she warned, her voice dropping to a serious whisper, "do not go alone. And do not let them get you into a side room. They want you isolated because you are easier to break when no one else is watching." The drive across Lake Washington to Bellevue offered no solace from the gathering storm. The city skyline gleamed against the twilight, an imposing fortress of wealth and corporate ambition. I pulled my car into the subterranean garage of a luxury high-rise, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Naomi's warning echoed in the confined space of the vehicle. "Do not let them get you into a side room." I had called Victor and June on the drive over, explaining the ambush my family had constructed. I did not ask for a rescue. I asked for their presence as stakeholders directly impacted by the unauthorized use of the Langford warehouse name. They agreed to meet me at the venue their arrival timed to coincide with the opening of the launch party. But I was early. I needed to confront Dennis before the crowds filled the room, before the spectacle made logic impossible. I rode the glass elevator to the rooftop level. The doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a sprawling event space enclosed by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the darkening city. The room smelled of expensive catering and fresh lilies. The launch was a masterclass in high-end aesthetic branding. Elegant display tables draped in black velvet showcased the first line of Heart and Veil luxury handbags. The lighting was meticulously curated to highlight the leather craftsmanship, projecting an aura of established, untouchable success. My parents had orchestrated this entire visual illusion. But as I stepped onto the polished concrete floor, the plan for a quiet, private negotiation disintegrated immediately. Dennis and Carol were not waiting for me in a secluded management office. They were standing directly in the center of the main display area, posing for a hired photographer in front of a massive floral arrangement bearing the Heart and Veil logo. My mother wore a sleek silver cocktail dress, her posture exuding total social dominance. My father adjusted his expensive suit jacket, projecting the image of a proud patriarch financing his daughter's brilliant entrepreneurial vision. They were already performing for the venue staff, refusing to yield the spotlight for a private confrontation. I paused near the entrance, assessing the room. The catering staff moved efficiently, arranging hors d'oeuvres, and the bartender polished glassware. It was too late for a closed-door meeting, and Naomi's advice suddenly felt like the only viable strategy. The public floor was the only safe territory. Before my parents noticed my arrival, a man stepped out from behind a large digital display board. It was Austin Vale Mallory's fiancé and the silent financial partner providing the other half of the brand's name. Austin was a charismatic, wealthy tech executive who adored my sister's creative energy. He greeted me with a wide, genuine smile, completely oblivious to the catastrophic reality of the shipment currently stranded at the port of Tacoma. Isabella Austin called out, closing the distance between us and offering a warm, familial hug. "I am so glad you made it back from Europe in time. Mallory told me you had a terrible experience with a lost passport." The lie stung, but the casual delivery revealed how thoroughly my sister had insulated her fiancé from her crimes. I offered a tight, polite smile, refusing to correct the narrative immediately. "I made it back," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Austin grabbed 2 glasses of sparkling water from a passing waiter and handed me one. He looked around the venue, his chest swelling with pride as he surveyed the elegant displays. "It looks incredible, doesn't it?" he asked. "Mallory has been stressed all week about the inventory arriving, but she kept telling me not to worry because you were handling the compliance behind the scenes." The statement hit me with the blunt force of a physical strike. Mallory had not just forged my signature on federal customs documents. She had actively used my professional reputation as a social and financial guarantee to calm her investors. Austin took a sip of his water, oblivious to the profound shock registering on my face. "It really put my mind at ease," he continued cheerfully. "You know how Mallory gets with paperwork. She hates the details. But she said you were the cautious one, making sure everything was clean before the launch." The emotional gravity of the betrayal pulled me under for a terrifying second. My sister had sold my integrity to secure her fiancé's capital. She needed Austin to believe the imports were legally sound, so she attached my name to the brand as a silent, unwilling guarantor of compliance. My parents' abandonment at the airport was not just an attempt to keep me away from a specific shipment. It was a desperate maneuver to protect the illusion of this entire business venture from the one person who could expose the rot in the foundation. I set my glass of water down on a nearby cocktail table. I could not maintain the polite fiction for another second. The risk of exposing the federal hold was severe. I was bound by strict compliance protocols, but remaining silent while my name was actively weaponized was professional suicide. "Austin," I said, dropping the conversational pleasantries. My voice hardened into a quiet, serious register. "I need you to listen to me very carefully." The shift in my tone caught him off guard. His smile faltered, replaced by a guarded, confused expression. "What is wrong?" Is the inventory delayed? I am not handling the compliance for Heart and Veil, I stated, choosing my words with clinical precision. I did not sign the customs power of attorney, and I did not authorize my name to be listed as the importer of record on the incoming freight. Austin stared at me, his brow furrowing as he tried to process the contradiction. But Mallory showed me the email confirmations. She said you cleared the containers for release this morning. There is no clean release, Austin. I warned him, stepping slightly closer so my voice would not carry across the room. The shipment is currently under a federal hold at the port of Tacoma, pending an investigation into unauthorized signatures. You need to protect your investment. I strongly advise you to ask Mallory directly whether the inventory is legally cleared to enter commerce. The cheerful tech executive vanished. The reality of a federal investigation crashing into his brand launch triggered an immediate self-protective instinct. His loyalty to Mallory was suddenly eclipsed by the terrifying prospect of financial and legal liability. He looked toward the center of the room, his eyes searching the crowd for his fiancée. Before Austin could take a step toward Mallory, my mother intervened. Carol had spotted me talking to Austin from across the venue. She abandoned the photographer, moving with swift, aggressive purpose. She inserted herself smoothly between Austin and me, pasting a bright artificial smile on her face to mask the sheer panic radiating from her rigid posture. Isabella, sweetheart. Carol practically sang, her voice pitched perfectly to sound maternal to any onlookers. I was wondering when you would arrive. She turned her back to Austin, effectively shielding him from me, and leaned in close. The smile remained, but her eyes were cold, filled with a vindictive, desperate heat. Her voice dropped to a harsh, venomous hiss meant only for my ears. "What do you think you are doing?" Carol demanded. "You are poisoning the room. You were supposed to meet your father in the service hallway, not stand out here spreading lies to Austin." I did not flinch. I did not retreat. "I am simply clarifying my professional boundaries, Carol," I replied, refusing to use the title of mother. "I am ensuring that my name is not used to sell fraudulent inventory." Carol's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "You are destroying your sister's life because you cannot handle sharing the spotlight," she accused, twisting the narrative with breathtaking speed. "You are going to walk into the back hallway right now, and you are going to listen to your father, or I swear to God, Isabella, you will never—" She didn't get to finish the threat. Austin stepped around my mother, refusing to be managed. The easygoing fiancé was gone. He looked directly past Carol, his gaze locking onto Mallory, who had just emerged from the catering kitchen carrying a clipboard. Mallory saw the three of us standing rigidly near the entrance, and the color drained completely from her face. She knew exactly what had just happened. Austin did not lower his voice. He did not care about the venue staff or the photographer hovering nearby. He walked straight toward my sister, stopping just inches from her. Mallory Austin demanded, his voice cutting clearly through the ambient noise of the rooftop venue. "Is the shipment under hold or not?" The direct question hung in the air of the rooftop venue, freezing the catering staff and the photographer in their tracks. Mallory gripped her clipboard, staring at Austin. Her eyes darted from her fiancé to me, and finally to our mother standing rigidly just behind Austin's shoulder. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds before Mallory deployed the only defense mechanism she truly understood. She lied. "It is just a routine customs check," Austin Mallory said, her voice pitched high, aiming for a casual, dismissive tone. "They pull random containers all the time. It is nothing to worry about. The inventory will be here by tomorrow afternoon." Austin did not relax. He was a tech executive accustomed to spotting inconsistencies in venture capital pitches. A routine check does not require Isabella to formally object to the paperwork, he countered, crossing his arms over his chest. "She just told me the shipment is under a federal hold because she did not authorize her name as the importer." Mallory's casual facade cracked. The panic bled through, replaced instantly by defensive anger. She glared at me, her knuckles turning white against the clipboard. "Isabella caused the hold," she snapped, pointing an accusing finger in my direction. "She is throwing a fit because she felt left out of the branding decisions. I asked her to handle the compliance as a favor, and now she is trying to sabotage the launch out of pure spite." The speed with which she shifted the blame was breathtaking. She seamlessly transitioned from denying the hold to blaming me for creating it. I did not agree to handle the compliance, Mallory, I said, maintaining my flat professional delivery. You forged a power of attorney using an old signature. You committed identity theft. That is ridiculous, Mallory shot back, her voice rising. You verbally approved the paperwork before we left for Europe. You told me to go ahead and file it. You are just exhausted from the trip and trying to backpedal because you messed up the entry codes. Before I could dismantle the absurd claim that verbal permission somehow overrides a forged federal document, my father stepped into the escalating confrontation. Dennis emerged from the shadows of the display tables, moving with his characteristic aggressive authority. He positioned himself squarely beside Mallory, presenting a unified, towering front. Mallory is telling the truth. Dennis stated, his deep voice attempting to bulldoze the doubt right out of Austin's mind. Isabella agreed to manage the imports. She has been erratic and difficult since we arrived in Amsterdam, causing scenes and making wild accusations. We have been trying to manage her stress, but she is actively trying to ruin her sister's business. Carol stepped closer to Austin, placing a gentle, sympathetic hand on his forearm. Isabella has always struggled with this. Carol murmured, her tone dripping with manufactured sorrow. She has always been so jealous of Mallory's spark. We thought putting her in charge of the paperwork would make her feel included, but she just cannot handle the pressure of a real launch. I stood there suffocating under the coordinated weight of their lies. They were executing the smear campaign flawlessly, layering gaslighting over character assassination right in front of the man financing the entire operation. They painted me as the bitter, incompetent spinster trying to tear down the radiant, successful sister. The elevator bell chimed a soft, melodic sound that cut through the tension. The polished steel doors slid open. The first wave of launch guests arrived. A group of local boutique owners and fashion influencers stepped onto the rooftop, laughing and holding expensive gift bags. The private confrontation was instantly over. The venue was no longer a safe space to debate federal compliance. It was a public stage, and my family immediately slipped back into their performative roles. Carol squeezed Austin's arm, flashing a brilliant, welcoming smile toward the arriving guests. "We will sort out this silly misunderstanding privately," she whispered to him. "Let's focus on celebrating Mallory tonight." Mallory smoothed her dress, handing her clipboard to a passing waiter, and rushed forward to greet the buyers. Austin hesitated, his expression torn between suspicion and the social obligation to support his fiancée in a room full of industry peers. He threw one last hard look at me before allowing Carol to steer him toward the bar. I was suddenly isolated near the entrance, the guests flowing around me like water around a stone. My decision to arrive early to seek a private negotiation had completely backfired. I had walked directly into their ambush, allowing them to corner me and dictate the narrative to Austin before I could present a single piece of hard evidence. Naomi's warning rang in my ears. I had mistakenly believed that the threat of a public scene would force my parents to negotiate. I forgot that they thrived on public scenes because they controlled the script. A heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. Dennis gripped my jacket, steering me forcefully away from the arriving guests toward the dark, narrow service hallway near the catering kitchen. The sudden physical control mirrored the moment at the Schiphol checkpoint when he took my passport. He pushed me through the swinging doors into the dim concrete corridor. The smell of garbage and industrial cleaning supplies replaced the scent of lilies. "You are going to walk out there and read the statement your sister drafted." Dennis ordered, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You will smile, you will apologize to Austin, and you will fix this." I shrugged his hand off my shoulder, backing away until my shoulders hit the cold cinder block wall. "I am not reading a lie," I said, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts to hold it steady. "I am not taking the fall for your federal crime." Dennis stepped closer, invading my personal space. His sheer physical size meant to intimidate me into submission. "You think you have the upper hand because you filed a piece of paper in Tacoma," he sneered. "You have no idea how this game is played." Elaine Porter was very interested to hear about your little outburst in Europe. She was very concerned that you might be mixing your personal jealousies with corporate accounts. He leaned in, the threat hanging explicitly in the stale air. You can either be difficult privately or unemployed publicly, Isabella. Read the statement, or I will make sure your career burns down with this launch." The threat hit its mark. The sickening realization that my father was perfectly willing to destroy my entire livelihood simply to protect Mallory's fraudulent inventory paralyzed me. They held all the social power in the venue. They had already poisoned Austin. They were threatening my job. If I walked out onto that rooftop and tried to explain the forged documents, I would look exactly like the crazy, jealous sister Carol had described. It was a false defeat, but it felt incredibly real. I was outmatched. I looked at my father, seeing the cold, unyielding arrogance in his eyes. I almost broke. I almost walked out the service doors, down the fire escape, and away from the family, entirely abandoning my name to the wreckage. My temporary phone buzzed violently in my jacket pocket, breaking the paralyzing spell. I pulled the device out. The screen displayed a new voicemail notification. The caller ID showed my father's cell phone number, but he was standing right in front of me. I hit play, holding the speaker close to my ear. The audio crackled with the background noise of a busy airport terminal. It was a pocket dial. Dennis must have accidentally triggered a call to my number while rushing through Schiphol earlier that morning. The recording captured a conversation between my father and Mallory. "Are you sure the broker received the power of attorney?" Dennis asked, his voice clear and distinct on the recording. "Yes, Dad." Mallory replied, her tone flippant and annoyed. "I sent the trace signature yesterday. Just make sure she doesn't get her phone back." Dennis let out a short, harsh laugh. "By the time she gets back, the shipment will be cleared, and she'll learn to stop threatening you over some boring paperwork." The voicemail ended with a sharp click. I stood in the service hallway staring at the dark screen of the phone. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The lingering, emotional doubt, the small, desperate hope that my father had merely been a weak enabler, was completely obliterated. He knew about the trace signature. He actively conspired to strand me. The airport abandonment was expressly designed to keep me unavailable until the fraudulent clearance was complete. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, absolute clarity. I had the intent proof. I had the smoking gun that destroyed the entire narrative of travel stress and verbal permission. I looked up at Dennis. He was waiting for my answer, expecting the familiar, quiet surrender he had commanded my entire life. I hit the dial pad and called June. She answered on the first ring. "The private talk is over," I said, staring directly into my father's arrogant eyes. I did not wait for his reaction. I pushed past him, shoving the heavy swinging doors open, and stepped back out onto the glowing rooftop venue. The party was in full swing. Waiters circulated with champagne, and the display tables were crowded with admiring guests. I did not walk toward the exit. I walked toward the center of the room. The polished steel doors of the main elevator chimed, sliding open, to reveal the glowing interior of the cab. Victor Langford stepped out onto the Bellevue rooftop, his tailored wool suit cutting a sharp contrast against the trendy party attire. June walked right beside him, holding her heavy leather briefcase. They did not look like guests arriving for a celebration. They looked like an execution squad. The Bellevue rooftop hummed with the curated energy of a successful brand launch. String lights hung above the display tables, casting a warm, inviting glow over the carefully arranged leather handbags and silk scarves. Beyond the glass perimeter, Lake Washington reflected the dark indigo of the evening sky and the distant, glittering skyline of Seattle. Waiters glided through the crowd, offering silver trays of champagne and miniature hors d'oeuvres. The air was filled with the light, rhythmic chatter of boutique buyers, local fashion influencers, and potential investors. It was the exact environment my sister thrived in, a stage designed entirely for appearance and applause. Mallory stood near the primary display table holding a microphone. Austin stood proudly beside her, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. She beamed at the assembled crowd, projecting the image of a visionary entrepreneur taking her first bold step into international commerce. "Thank you all so much for coming tonight," Mallory said. Her voice amplified clearly over the rooftop speakers. "Your presence means everything. Launching Heart and Veil has been an incredible journey. It takes an immense amount of dedication to build a woman-owned global brand from the ground up, and I am so grateful to share this initial collection with you." The crowd offered a warm, enthusiastic round of applause. My mother Carol stood near the front row clapping loudly, her face flushed with maternal pride. She glanced back over her shoulder, searching for me near the service hallway. She expected to see the quiet, defeated daughter, ready to step forward and deliver the drafted apology statement. She expected total surrender. Her eyes locked onto me standing in the center of the room. The triumphant smile on her face faltered. The elevator doors chimed a second time, sliding shut as Victor Langford and June Callahan stepped fully onto the event floor. The atmosphere on the rooftop changed instantly. The shift was not marked by a sudden loud disruption, but by a rapid, quiet ripple of recognition spreading through the affluent crowd. Several prominent buyers and investors in the room recognized Victor immediately. He was not a fashion influencer. He was a cornerstone of Pacific Northwest commerce, a man whose shipping empire controlled the logistical lifeblood of the region. His presence at a boutique launch party was a massive, unexpected endorsement or a glaring anomaly. Mallory saw the sudden shift in the crowd's attention. She lowered the microphone, spotting Victor navigating through the clusters of guests. The color drained from her cheeks. The confident visionary entrepreneur vanished, replaced by a panicked woman, realizing the real world had just breached her carefully constructed bubble. She attempted to maintain the facade, forcing a bright, brittle smile onto her face as Victor stopped directly in front of the main display table. Mr. Langford Mallory greeted him, her voice wavering slightly. "We are so honored you could make it tonight. I did not realize you were on the guest list." Victor did not return the smile. He did not extend his hand to accept a glass of champagne. He stood with the quiet, imposing stillness of a man accustomed to demanding answers in executive boardrooms. "I am not on the guest list," Victor stated, his voice calm, carrying clearly to the surrounding guests who had quieted down to listen. "I am here to ask a very specific logistical question regarding your global brand. I need to know why Hart and Vail designated my bonded warehouse in Tacoma as the intended storage facility for a commercial freight release without requesting authorization or signing a receiving contract." The question landed like a heavy stone on the display table. The surrounding buyers and investors exchanged confused, worried glances. In the world of high-end retail logistics, unauthorized use of a bonded warehouse is not a minor administrative error. It signals severe compliance issues and potentially fraudulent operations. Mallory let out a sharp, nervous laugh. It sounded too loud, too frantic for the sophisticated setting. She looked at Austin, who was staring at her with mounting alarm, and then turned back to Victor. "Oh, that must just be a minor paperwork mix-up." Mallory deflected, waving her hand dismissively. "I do not handle the boring trade details myself. My sister Isabella manages all the compliance and customs filings for the brand. She is our expert behind the scenes. She was trying to use my name as a shield one last time, attempting to deflect the federal liability directly onto me in front of her entire professional network. She thought she could sacrifice my reputation to save her launch." I stepped out of the crowd, walking deliberately to the display table. I stood shoulder to shoulder with Victor, facing my sister, my parents, and the silent, staring audience of buyers. "No," I said plainly, my voice steady and unyielding. "I did not." I opened the folder June had handed me moments before. I did not pull out dramatic legal threats or emotional letters. I produced the cold, hard documentation. I placed the redacted Customs and Border Protection hold notice directly on top of the velvet display table, right next to Mallory's flagship handbag. Pinned beneath it was a copy of the unauthorized Customs power of attorney bearing the forged signature. I kept my explanation brief and strictly factual, adhering to the professional boundaries of my occupation. I did not disclose the full extent of the criminal investigation, but I confirmed the exact nature of the identity misuse. My travel documents were removed from my possession at an airport in Amsterdam, I stated, looking directly at the crowd of buyers who were now leaning in to listen. While I was physically stranded and unable to access federal systems, my name and my previous signature were used without my consent to establish the importer of record for this inventory. I tapped the CBP hold notice resting on the table. The shipment tied to this launch is not cleared for commerce. It is currently under a hard federal hold at the Port of Tacoma, pending an investigation into unauthorized signatures and fraudulent filings. I am not the compliance officer for Heart and Veil, and I do not authorize the release of these goods. The control of the room shifted entirely in that moment. It moved from Mallory's curated aesthetic performance to the undeniable reality of a federal boundary. The illusion of the successful global brand shattered against the cold, hard facts printed on the official government letterhead. I acknowledged my own flaw in front of the room, accepting accountability for the delay in speaking the truth. I attempted to handle this privately earlier this evening. I admitted looking at Austin, whose face had gone completely pale. I wanted to avoid a public scene because I mistakenly believed my family would negotiate honestly. I was wrong. The paperwork is forged and the inventory is locked down. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and devastatingly quiet. The guests did not gasp or shout. They reacted with the swift, ruthless self-preservation typical of the business world. A prominent boutique buyer standing near the front of the display table slowly lowered her champagne glass. She reached out and quietly removed her business card from the silver vendor bowl sitting next to Mallory's clipboard. Several other investors stepped backward, physically distancing themselves from the display tables. They were silently severing their ties to a brand contaminated by federal fraud allegations. I refused to carry the shame of the public exposure anymore. The embarrassment belonged to the people who committed the crime, not the person who reported it. Mallory stared at the removed business card, her hands shaking violently. The launch was dying in real time, right in front of her eyes. Carol stood frozen near the edge of the crowd, her mouth opening and closing silently, unable to formulate a lie convincing enough to counter the CBP notice sitting on the table. Dennis, however, reacted with the explosive aggression of a patriarch losing total control of his domain. He lunged out from the service hallway, shoving past a startled waiter. He marched directly toward the display table, his face flushed dark red with fury. He saw the federal hold notice resting on the velvet, and his instinct was to physically remove the evidence. He believed if he could snatch the paper away, he could somehow bully the room back into submission. He reached across the display table, his large hand aiming directly for the folder containing the CBP notice and the forged power of attorney. Before his fingers could graze the paper, a man stepped seamlessly out of the shadow cast by the digital display board. It was Victor's personal security consultant, who had been quietly monitoring the room since they exited the elevator. The consultant did not draw a weapon or shout a command. He simply stepped forward, inserting his large frame between my father and the table, raising a firm, rigid forearm to block Dennis's hand without actually touching him. Dennis recoiled from the security consultant's blocking arm, his face flushing a deeper, more volatile shade of red. He did not deliver a polished, theatrical villain speech. He exploded with the raw, ugly, ordinary anger of a father used to bullying his household into submission. "This is your sister's night," Dennis shouted, his voice cracking slightly as it echoed across the quiet rooftop. He jabbed a finger in my direction, ignoring the crowd of industry professionals watching his meltdown. "You always have to do this. You always have to prove you're smarter than everyone else. You couldn't just let her have one successful moment without tearing it down with your bureaucratic nonsense." He was trying to shrink the federal crime back down to the size of a petty sibling rivalry, hoping the audience would view my actions as a personal vendetta rather than a legal intervention. Carol rushed forward, stepping beside my father, instantly deploying her tears. She pressed a hand to her chest, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated manufactured distress. "Please, everyone," she pleaded, looking around at the stunned buyers. "Isabella is just traumatized from travel. She had a terrible experience overseas, and she misunderstood the routine paperwork. She is confused and lashing out. Mallory seized the lifeline our mother threw. I had verbal permission," she cried out, her voice pitching high with panic. "She told me I could file the entry. She knew I was sending the documents to the broker." Austin stood a few feet away, his expression hardening. He ignored Carol's tears and Dennis's shouting. He looked directly at Mallory, the man who had financed the launch, suddenly realizing he had financed a liability. Mallory Austin said, his tone dropping the supportive warmth it had carried all evening. Answer the question. Did Isabella sign the customs power of attorney, or did you forge it? Mallory hesitated, glancing frantically at our parents for a rescue that was not coming. She knew enough. Mallory stammered, crossing her arms defensively. She handles this stuff all the time. She knew the shipment was coming. The evasion was a confession in itself. Austin shook his head, running a hand over his face as the reality of the legal exposure settled in. I did not raise my voice to argue with them. I did not try to shout over my father's accusations or my mother's crying. My growth in that moment was realizing I no longer needed to over-explain myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. I did not need to defend my sanity against the travel trauma narrative. I had the intent proof, and I was going to let it do the talking. I picked up my temporary phone from the display table. I tapped the screen opening the saved audio file and turned the volume to the maximum setting. I held the phone up, letting the recording cut clearly through the tense air of the Bellevue rooftop. The audio crackled with the background noise of the Schiphol Airport terminal. "Are you sure the broker received the power of attorney?" my father's recorded voice asked, sharp and distinct. "Yes, Dad," Mallory's recorded voice replied, sounding annoyed. "I sent the Trace signature yesterday. Just make sure she doesn't get her phone back. By the time she gets back, the shipment will be cleared." Dennis laughed on the recording, and she'll learn to stop threatening you over some boring paperwork. The voicemail ended. I placed the phone back on the velvet table next to the CBP hold notice. The rooftop went entirely still. The silence that followed was not merely quiet. It was the sound of a carefully constructed reality collapsing. The deep, practical meaning of the airport abandonment was laid bare for the entire room to witness. My family expected my silence. They engineered my isolation to bypass federal laws, and they prepared a punishment story, the travel stress narrative to deploy if I managed to fight back. I did not say another word. I let the silence work. A prominent boutique buyer, the woman who had earlier removed her business card from the vendor bowl, stepped forward. She looked at Mallory, her professional curiosity entirely gone, replaced by the cold calculus of retail liability. "Is any of this inventory actually sellable?" the buyer asked, gesturing toward the display tables. "Can you guarantee the chain of custody?" Mallory opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at the CBP hold notice, then at the buyer, completely unable to answer the operational question. Without a legitimate importer of record, the cargo trapped in Tacoma was essentially contraband. The launch inventory was socially and commercially dead. Victor Langford broke his silence, delivering the final quiet confirmation the industry crowd needed. He did not threaten lawsuits or grandstand. He stated a simple corporate fact. Langford Maritime does not accept unauthorized or fraudulently manifested freight, Victor said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a maritime CEO. "My facilities are closed to this brand." Austin Vale reached down to his left wrist. He unclasped the heavy, expensive Heart and Vale branded watch Mallory had given him as a launch day gift. He slid it off his arm and set it down on the velvet display table next to the phone and the hold notice. The metal band clicked softly against the wood. The gesture was profound in its simplicity. It was the physical withdrawal of his support, his capital, and his name. Austin looked at Mallory, his expression stripped of all the affection he had displayed just an hour earlier. "Do not use my name on another invoice, another post, or another box," he said, his voice flat and uncompromising. He turned away from the display table, not looking back at Carol or Dennis, and walked steadily toward the polished steel doors of the main elevator. The Bellevue rooftop moments ago, a vibrant stage for luxury branding, transformed instantly into an uncomfortable evacuation zone. The music from the invisible speakers seemed suddenly too loud against the stark silence of the crowd. Guests began moving toward the elevators in tight, awkward clusters. They clutched their coats and avoided eye contact with the display tables, whispering urgently among themselves. The glittering launch party had died, leaving behind only the cold reality of a federal fraud allegation. As the crowd thinned, an older woman with silver hair paused near the center display. She owned a highly respected chain of independent boutiques in the Pacific Northwest. She looked at Mallory, shaking her head slightly, then turned her gaze to me. "My niece is in compliance," the woman said quietly, her voice carrying a tone of deep professional respect. "Good for you." She turned and joined the exodus, her exit serving as the final confirmation that Mallory's inventory was commercially toxic. The buyers were gone, the investors were gone, the brand was over before the first shipment even left the dock. Mallory finally broke. The polished influencer facade shattered, replaced by raw, panicked fury. She grabbed a leather handbag from the display table and threw it to the floor. "You destroyed my life!" she screamed, her voice cracking as she pointed at me. "You came here just to ruin this. You could have fixed the paperwork quietly, but you just had to make a scene." Carol stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached out instinctively, trying to bridge the gap and smooth over the catastrophe. "Isabella," she pleaded, tears spilling over her mascara, "you could have warned us privately. You did not have to do this in front of everyone." The profound hypocrisy of her statement hung in the air. She completely ignored the reality that I had arrived early specifically to speak privately, only to be cornered and threatened with career sabotage. They had ambushed me, and now they were playing the victims of the very spectacle they had demanded I attend. Dennis, realizing his intimidation tactics were entirely useless in the face of the recorded voicemail, attempted a weak face-saving pivot. He straightened his jacket, trying to recapture a fraction of his lost patriarchal authority. "We made a mistake, Isabella," he admitted, though the words sounded forced, devoid of any genuine remorse. "We rushed the paperwork because the timeline was tight. But you went too far tonight. You embarrassed this family, and you are going to regret burning these bridges." I looked at the three of them standing amidst the wreckage of their own deceit. I felt a profound, exhausting sadness, but the desperate need to explain myself to them was finally gone. "I am setting a boundary," I said, keeping my voice calm and absolutely clear. "Do not contact my employer again. Do not call my phone. Any further communication regarding the federal hold or the documents bearing my name will go exclusively through my legal counsel." I gestured toward June, who stood quietly observing the fallout. "June will send a formal written notice to your broker revoking any claimed authority under my identity," I continued. "You have lost access to my name, my expertise, and my presence." I turned my back on them, refusing to offer Carol the comfort of a prolonged argument, or Dennis the satisfaction of the last word. The people who had intentionally stranded me without an identity no longer possessed the power to make me feel small. I walked toward the elevators, joining Victor and June. The doors slid open, revealing Austin standing inside. He was not looking at the rooftop or the ruined displays. He held his phone up, speaking quietly but firmly on speakerphone to an older man whose voice carried the distinct, measured cadence of a corporate attorney. "Yes, freeze the initial capital transfer immediately." Austin instructed his parents' lawyer, stepping to the back of the elevator car to make room for us. "I need a full review of my exposure on the LLC documents by morning. We are done here." It was not a dramatic emotional exit. It was the swift clinical detachment of a man severing financial ties to a liability. We rode the elevator down to the lobby in silence. The descent felt incredibly long, the adrenaline slowly draining from my system, leaving a heavy, bone-deep fatigue in its wake. When the doors opened to the ground floor, Victor turned to me, offering a final measure of support. "My driver is waiting outside," Victor said smoothly. "We can take you straight home, Isabella." I appreciated the offer, recognizing the protective instinct behind it. But before I could accept, the lobby doors pushed open. Naomi stepped inside, shaking the light Seattle rain from her coat. She had left the office after her shift ended, driving across the bridge specifically to make sure I did not leave the venue alone. She looked at me, assessing my pale face and the absolute exhaustion in my posture. "I've got her," Naomi said to Victor, stepping forward and linking her arm through mine. "My car is right out front." I chose Naomi. It was a conscious, deliberate choice. Victor had been a powerful ally, providing the legal leverage and the transportation necessary to survive the airport abandonment, but I refused to replace my family's control with a dependency on a wealthy stranger. Naomi was my peer, my friend, and my anchor back to my real life. "Thank you, Victor," I said, offering a genuine tired smile. "For everything." Victor nodded, understanding the boundary completely. He shook my hand, his grip firm and respectful, before walking out to his waiting town car with June. I walked out into the cool, damp night air with Naomi, the Seattle rain feeling like a physical relief against my skin. We climbed into her small sedan, the heater blasting, cutting through the damp chill. Naomi pulled out of the parking garage, merging onto the highway, heading back across Lake Washington. "You were right to stop the shipment, Isabella," she said quietly, keeping her eyes on the road. "But the public fallout is going to be ugly. Your family is going to spin this. They are going to blame you for the brand collapsing." "I know," I replied, leaning my head against the cool glass of the passenger window. "I accept that. They can tell whatever story they want to their friends. I stopped the freight and I protected my career. I can live with the gossip." I was shaken. The emotional cost of watching my family actively try to destroy me was profound, but as I sat in the passenger seat of my friend's car, I realized something vital. I was no longer alone in a foreign holding room. I was no longer isolated by my parents' manipulation. My temporary phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out, assuming it was another angry text from my mother or a final threat from Dennis. It was not a text message. It was an email notification from my apartment building's digital mailroom system, alerting me that a certified document had just been scanned into my inbox. I tapped the screen, opening the PDF file. The letterhead belonged to a prominent law office located in Spokane. The signature at the bottom of the scanned page was handwritten, the sharp, aggressive strokes instantly recognizable. It was from my father. 3 weeks later, the physical copy of the letter my father had scanned from that Spokane law office sat on the desk of my Seattle apartment. Outside, a steady rhythmic rain streaked the window glass, blurring the city skyline into a wash of muted grays and deep greens. I picked up the heavy watermarked paper. It was not an apology. Even after the public collapse of the launch, the loss of Austin's capital, and the unmasking of the fraudulent import scheme, Dennis could not bring himself to express genuine remorse. The letter read like a crisis management directive drafted by a man who still believed he could negotiate his way out of a burning building. He asked me to soften my official statements to Customs and Border Protection. He suggested that framing the forged power of attorney as a simple administrative misunderstanding would save Carol and Mallory from permanent damage to their reputations and future endeavors. He invoked the concept of family loyalty one last time, hinting that leniency now might leave the door open for a relationship later. I did not draft a reply. I did not call the law office to argue. I folded the letter along its original creases, opened a pristine manila folder, and filed it away next to the carbon copy of the stolen document report I had filed in Amsterdam. The silence I offered in return was absolute. They had lost the privilege of my explanation. My phone buzzed softly against the wooden desktop. A text message appeared on the screen, bypassing the filters I had set up over the past few weeks. It was from a new unknown number, but the voice in the text was unmistakable. "You ruined everything," Mallory wrote. "Austin will not even take my calls to discuss unwinding the LLC. The vendors are demanding their deposits back. You could have just fixed the paperwork, but you had to be the hero. I hope you are happy playing the victim while my brand is dead." It was the dying echo of the golden child, entirely incapable of accepting that her own actions had dismantled her life. She still believed I was a utility that had maliciously malfunctioned, rather than a person who had simply refused to be buried under her mistakes. I tapped the screen, selected the new number, and blocked it. I set the phone down. The screen went dark, and the apartment remained quiet. An hour later, I sat across from Elaine Porter in her bright glass-walled office at the logistics firm. She handed me a fresh cup of coffee, her expression conveying a deep professional respect that had only solidified since the night of the Bellevue rooftop confrontation. "Your position here has never been more secure," Isabella Elaine said, leaning back in her chair. "We ran a full internal audit on your accounts just to be thorough. Your firewall was immaculate. You protected this firm from a severe federal liability, and you handled a catastrophic personal ambush with remarkable precision. She took a sip of her coffee, her gaze sharpening into the strategic focus that made her such a formidable director. I want to use what happened, she continued. Family-based identity misuse is a blind spot in our industry. Brokers assume that because a last name matches or a relative makes the call, the authorization is legitimate. I want you to help me design a training module for our incoming compliance officers. We need to teach them how to spot the exact vulnerabilities your sister tried to exploit. I agreed without hesitation. Taking the weapon my family had forged and dismantling it to protect others felt like the ultimate reclamation of my career. But my professional horizon was expanding far beyond my current desk. A week after the launch party, Victor Langford had requested a formal meeting. He did not invite me to a coffee shop or a quiet dinner. He asked me to come to the executive boardroom of Langford Maritime. He offered me a director-level compliance role overseeing the exact bonded warehouses my sister had attempted to infiltrate. It was a staggering career leap, a position that came with intense federal scrutiny and significant corporate authority. A year ago, the old version of me might have viewed the offer as a rescue, eagerly accepting the protection of a powerful mentor to replace the family structure I had just lost. But I had learned the profound danger of entering into agreements where the power dynamic was unbalanced. I did not say yes immediately. I thanked Victor for the offer, took the contract, and hired an independent employment attorney to review every single clause. I took 2 full weeks to negotiate the terms. I insisted on strict written boundaries regarding my autonomy, ensuring that my reporting structure and my compliance authority were insulated from any executive interference. I needed to know that I was being hired for my unyielding adherence to the law, not as a favor for surviving an airport detention. Victor did not balk at the negotiations. In fact, he welcomed them. When I finally signed the employment contract, I did so not as a rescued traveler, but as a recognized industry peer. That afternoon, I walked into a small, independent leather goods shop in the historic Pioneer Square district. The air smelled of tanning oil and rich dye. I browsed the glass display cases until I found exactly what I was looking for. It was a passport wallet crafted from deep forest green leather. It was sturdy, elegant, and designed to hold only one booklet. I asked the shop owner to monogram the bottom right corner. I watched as he pressed the hot brass letters into the green leather. I.H. Just my initials. No shared family itineraries. No communal travel binders managed by my father. The document that granted me passage across the globe would belong exclusively to me, carried in my own hands. When I moved into my new port-facing office at Langford Maritime a week later, I brought a small, sleek black frame with me. I did not hang it on the wall to display a college diploma or a corporate award. I placed it on the bookshelf behind my desk. Inside the frame was the fragile paper emergency passport the consulate had issued me in Amsterdam. I did not frame it as a monument to my trauma. I framed it as concrete proof that when the people who were supposed to protect me walked away, I had the strength to get myself home. The growth I experienced over those weeks was profound, but it was not without its shadows. Healing is rarely a perfect, painless upward trajectory. There are still evenings when I stand by my office window at dusk, watching the white and green commuter ferries carve slow, glowing paths across the dark waters of Puget Sound, and I feel a sudden sharp ache in my chest. I mourn the family I wanted. I grieve the parents who should have celebrated my success instead of trying to steal it, and the sister who should have been my closest ally. But the grief no longer dictates my actions. The desperate need to over-explain myself, to shrink my boundaries, to accommodate their comfort, is entirely gone. I no longer fear the public truth because I learned that the truth is only dangerous to the people trying to hide in the dark. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Langford Maritime Executive Conference Room, a warm cup of coffee resting in my hand. Below me, the sprawling expanse of the port stretched out along the waterfront. The massive steel container cranes moved with slow, rhythmic precision, lifting heavy cargo boxes off the decks of international freighters. It was the very gateway my family had tried to use against me. They had intended to turn this port into the site of my professional ruin. Now, looking out over the rows of steel and the deep water, I knew this territory belonged to my work. I was the one standing watch. If you are listening to this and someone has ever used the concept of family as permission to cross your boundaries, to take your labor, your identity, or your peace, I need you to know that you do not owe them your silence. You do not have to absorb their mistakes to keep their false image intact. Protect the documents with your name on them, guard the life you have built, and never be afraid to stand in the light and tell your story. Because the moment you stop carrying their secrets, you finally get to carry yourself.